Hello again. There's a treat in store today because we should be looking at somebody who could not even write her own name, but nevertheless has, by the wonders of multiculturalism, become a prominent writer. No mean feat, I feel sure you'll agree. The educational resource, so called, from the Royal Mint, which we looked at yesterday, apart from the characters that I did talk about, there's a list of what are described as prominent black writers of the late 18th and early 19th century. One of the names caught my eye because it was that of an illiterate woman, and I was a little puzzled to know just how an illiterate person might become a prominent writer. In the usual way of things, this would be quite impossible, of course, but when white liberals are dealing with black people, anything is possible. Why shouldn't the definition of the word writer become so elastic that it includes somebody who cannot actually write? It would surely be racist and elitist to expect a black writer to be capable of writing. The writer concerned was a former black slave called Mary Prince. Her name cropped up in the comments here yesterday because there's an urban myth among black people that she was the first woman ever to present a petition to Parliament. It's not true, obviously, but there it is. I've seen this on a number of sites lately. Mary Prince was born a slave in the British colony of Bermuda in the 18th century. In 1828, the family who owned, as it was then said, her, came to England, and shortly afterwards she left their employment and became mixed up with the abolitionist movement in London. The trade in slaves in 1828 had of course been made illegal decades earlier, but it was still legal in the British colonies. So in the Caribbean, there were still slaves, and there was a fairly strong political movement amongst people of goodwill in England to abolish slavery entirely throughout the whole of the British Empire. It was a well-known abolitionist called Thomas Pringle who decided to use Mary Prince for, I suppose we can best say to use her for propaganda or publicity purposes, in a good cause, obviously. He arranged for a woman called Susanna Strickland to ghostwrite Mary Prince's life story. Susanna Strickland went on to become a well-known author herself in Canada. When this had been done, when Susanna Strickland had knocked something up after talking to Mary Prince, Pringle himself edited the manuscript to make sure it was lurid enough and conformed to what the abolitionists wished to say. Mary Prince herself didn't write a single word of it. How could she? She was quite unable to read or write, which also meant she had no way at all of knowing what was in her own autobiography, which is a curious state of affairs. I've remarked before on the odd fact that we know very little about the experiences of black slaves of that time in their own words. That is to say, black slaves in the 19th century, either in America or in the British Caribbean. Almost all that we know has been mediated via white people. Some writers, I'm thinking now of Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind, tried to make out that slaves were more or less happy, or at the very least content in their enslavement. Another white woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, claimed the opposite. I'm sure many of us will have read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Books supposedly written by former slaves such as Mary Prince and Solomon Northup, whose name was used for 12 years a slave, were actually written by abolitionists with an axe to grind, which means that we have to treat them with a little bit of caution. That's not to say that they're a pack of fairy tales, but they've been edited to make slavery as awful as possible, just as Mary Mitchell went out of her way to make slavery seem fairly innocuous and even cheerful, the abolitionists moved in the other direction to make slavery seem a terrible thing which should be abolished. 12 Years a Slave was written by David Wilson. Mary Prince's supposed autobiography was written by Susanna Strickland. Such books tell us little about what black slaves actually thought and felt, but an awful lot about what white abolitionists felt that they ought to be thinking and feeling. The same thing happened with another of the prominent black writers, which the Royal Mint's educational source cites. That's Akasawa Gronioso. As for the idea that Mary Prince was the first woman to petition Parliament, that's absolute rubbish. I mean, I could think of a dozen people offhand. In 1621 alone, which is over 200 years before Mary Prince's petition, there were three women, Elizabeth Scory, Hester Favour and Elizabeth Cochrane. There's nothing at all unusual about this. Women used to petition Parliament just as men did. I have an idea that Mary Prince is fast becoming one of those black people who built Britain. I've seen a lot of mention of her lately. I think she's turning into something of an icon. No doubt I should be denounced as a ferocious racist for suggesting that an absolute bare minimum qualification for being described as a writer is an ability to write. So rapidly is the bar being lowered lately where the achievements of black people are concerned, British history seems to be turning into some sort of demented limbo dancing competition. I dare say it will not be long before the very idea of literacy is regarded as a wicked neo-colonial conspiracy aimed against people of colour.